They gathered in the briefing room, elite soldiers all. Officers with chest full of ribbons, sergeants with years of combat experience etched into their weathered faces. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Colonel Marcus Stone outlined the day's advanced combat training exercise, but nobody noticed the quiet man in gray coveralls pushing a maintenance cart past the window. His name was Frank Morrison, though most people on base simply called him Maintenance, or didn't call him anything at all. For 15 years, he had been invisible. The man who fixed broken air conditioners when the California heat became unbearable, who unclogged toilets when the new recruits made rookie mistakes, who quietly swept the floors at 0500 when the world was still asleep. Frank was in his early 60s, with steel gray hair that he kept military short despite never being seen in uniform. His hands were weathered and calloused from decades of manual work, and he moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had learned to waste neither time nor energy. He spoke only when necessary, always in measured tones, and had perfected the art of being present but unnoticed. The Marines at Camp Pendleton had grown so accustomed to his presence that he had become part of the background, like the desert wind or the distant sound of helicopters. Recruits would curse about broken equipment, and Frank would appear silently to fix it. Officers would complain about facility issues, and Frank would resolve them without fanfare. He was the invisible foundation that kept their world functioning. On this particular morning, Captain Sarah Martinez was leading a group of new recruits through their first advanced marksmanship training. She was one of the few people who had ever bothered to exchange more than basic pleasantries with Frank, mostly because her grandfather had been a maintenance worker at a different base years ago. "Remember," she called out to the young Marines lined up at the firing range, "precision comes from patience. You can't rush a perfect shot." The recruits nodded enthusiastically, their faces bright with the confidence that comes before experience teaches humility. Frank wheeled his cart past the range, collecting empty ammunition boxes and straightening equipment that had been carelessly discarded. One of the recruits, Private Johnson, was struggling with his rifle, clearly frustrated by his inability to hit targets that seemed easy in theory. "This weapon is broken," Johnson muttered to his buddy, loud enough for others to hear. "The scope must be off." Frank glanced up briefly from his work, but said nothing. He had seen this same frustration thousands of times over the years. Young soldiers blaming their equipment when the real issue was technique, patience, and understanding that became refined through experience rather than instruction. "Let me see that rifle," Captain Martinez said, taking the weapon from Johnson. She examined it carefully, checking the scope alignment and testing the bolt action. "Everything looks fine, Private. Sometimes the problem isn't the equipment." As she handed the rifle back, Frank quietly approached. His movements were so unassuming that neither Martinez nor the recruit initially noticed him. "Excuse me, Captain," Frank said quietly. His voice carried an authority that seemed incongruous with his maintenance coveralls. "The scope mount on that rifle is loose. 3 degrees off center." Martinez looked at him with surprise. In all their brief interactions, Frank had never offered technical advice about weapons. "How can you tell from there?" Frank stepped closer, his experienced eyes examining the rifle without touching it. "The way the light reflects off the rear scope ring. And the recruit is compensating by pulling left, which means he instinctively knows something's wrong even if he can't identify it." Captain Martinez examined the weapon more closely and discovered that Frank was absolutely correct. The scope mount had indeed worked loose, creating exactly the kind of precision problem that would frustrate any shooter. "Thank you," she said, genuinely impressed. "How did you?" But Frank had already moved away, returning to his cart and his invisible work. The morning progressed with typical training routine efficiency. Weapons drills, tactical exercises, and the endless repetition that transforms civilian reflexes into military precision. Frank continued his rounds, maintaining the equipment and facilities that made their training possible. Around 1030 hours, the first alarm sounded that it wasn't the familiar tone of a training exercise or routine drill. This was the sharp, urgent wail that every person on a military base learns to recognize immediately. The sound that means genuine danger, real threat, and the difference between life and death. "All personnel, this is not a drill," the base-wide announcement crackled through speakers. We have confirmed hostile infiltration. Multiple sniper positions identified. All non-essential personnel report to secure areas immediately. Chaos erupted across the training grounds. Young Marines who had been practicing combat scenarios suddenly found themselves in actual combat. Officers shouted orders while trying to assess a rapidly developing situation. The confident atmosphere of controlled training transformed into the sharp tension of genuine crisis. Frank continued pushing his maintenance cart, seemingly unaffected by the alarm or the surrounding panic. "Hey, old man!" shouted Sergeant Williams, a drill instructor known for his intimidating presence and complete intolerance for anything that wasn't regulation perfect. "Didn't you hear the announcement? Get to the bunker now." Frank looked up calmly. "I heard it, Sergeant." "The move. This isn't a training exercise." "I know," Frank replied, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when discussing broken air conditioners. "I can help." Williams stared at him in disbelief. "Help? Your maintenance. Your help is staying out of the way while real Marines handle real problems." The second alarm sounded, indicating that the threat had escalated. Through the base communication system, reports filtered in of enemy snipers positioned at multiple locations, using advanced equipment and demonstrating professional-level marksmanship that had pinned down several units. Captain Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. "We've got Marines trapped in Building 7. Enemy sniper has them pinned from approximately 800 meters northeast. Every time someone tries to move, they take precise fire." Frank abandoned his cart and walked toward the armory. "Where the hell are you going?" Sergeant Williams demanded, following him. "To get a rifle," Frank answered simply. Williams grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? You're 60 years old and you work maintenance. This isn't some movie where the janitor saves the day." Frank gently but firmly removed Williams' hand from his arm. The movement was controlled, efficient, and spoke of physical capabilities that weren't immediately apparent in his usual maintenance worker demeanor. "Sergeant," Frank said quietly, "I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes." Something in his tone made Williams hesitate. There was an authority in Frank's voice that transcended rank or position, the kind of confidence that comes from experience rather than training. Frank entered the armory and selected an M40A3 sniper rifle, a weapon system he handled with the casual familiarity most people reserved for everyday tools. His movements were precise and economical as he checked the weapon, loaded ammunition, and made minor adjustments that spoke of deep, ingrained knowledge. "How do you know how to?" Williams began. "Later," Frank said, slinging the rifle across his shoulder. "Right now, we need to help those Marines." The enemy sniper had chosen his position well. From a water tower approximately 800 meters from Building 7, he had clear lines of sight to all exits and approaches. Every attempt to move had resulted in precise fire that demonstrated professional training and excellent equipment. Frank studied the tactical situation from behind cover, his experienced eyes reading terrain and wind patterns with the kind of expertise that comes from years of practical application. He identified not just the sniper's current position, but the 3 most likely secondary positions the enemy would use if forced to relocate. Captain Martinez, he called over the radio, having borrowed Williams' communication equipment. "Who is this?" "Frank Morrison. I'm going to eliminate the sniper. When I do, your people will have approximately 30 seconds to move before he can reposition. Make sure they're ready." "Frank? The maintenance guy? What are you?" "Ma'am, I need you to trust me. Have your Marines ready to move in 60 seconds. Frank found a position with clear sight lines to the water tower. The distance was significant and wind conditions were challenging, but not impossible. He settled behind the rifle with movements that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, his body automatically assuming a firing position that maximized stability and precision. Through the scope, he could see the enemy sniper clearly. Professional equipment, excellent positioning, and the patient demeanor of someone with considerable experience. This wasn't some amateur insurgent or opportunistic attacker. This was a trained operative with skills comparable to military special forces. Frank controlled his breathing, calculating wind speed and direction from subtle environmental cues that most people never noticed. The distant movement of grass, the way heat shimmer affected visibility, the barely perceptible shift in air pressure that indicated changing conditions. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. At 800 meters in challenging wind conditions with a borrowed rifle he had never fired before, Frank achieved a precision that would have impressed military snipers with decades of training. The enemy sniper dropped immediately, his threat eliminated in a single shot. "Building 7, you are clear to move," Frank announced calmly over the radio. Captain Martinez's Marines successfully extracted from their trapped position, but the crisis wasn't over. Reports continued filtering in of additional enemy positions throughout the base, each presenting tactical challenges that conventional responses were struggling to address effectively. "We've got another situation," Colonel Stone's voice came through the communication system. "Sniper team has taken position in the communications tower. Range approximately 1,200 meters. They're preventing access to our primary command center." Frank studied the new target through his scope. The communications tower presented a more complex challenge, with multiple potential shooting positions and excellent cover for the enemy snipers. "I can see 2 shooters," Frank reported. "Possibly a third in reserve position." "Frank," Colonel Stone's voice carried a note of confusion. "Who exactly are you?" "Right now, Colonel, I'm the person who can solve your sniper problem." The communications tower shot required a level of precision that pushed beyond normal military training. Multiple targets at extended range, with the need for rapid engagement to prevent the enemy from relocating or calling in additional support. Frank identified his targets and calculated a firing sequence that would eliminate both visible snipers before either could react or provide warning to potential backup positions. This kind of rapid precision shooting was a specialized skill that few people possessed even within elite military units. He fired twice in rapid succession. Both enemy snipers were eliminated with textbook precision, their threats neutralized before they could return fire or communicate warnings to other positions. "Targets down," Frank reported matter-of-factly. "Tower is clear." The base communication system came alive with reports of successful tactical advances as Marine units could finally move freely without fear of sniper fire. The enemy infiltration, which had initially seemed like a serious crisis, was rapidly being resolved through conventional tactical responses now that the sniper threat had been eliminated. Sergeant Williams approached Frank's position, his expression a mixture of awe and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he asked directly. Frank was methodically cleaning the rifle he had borrowed, his movements showing the same careful attention to detail he applied to maintaining base equipment. "Frank Morrison," he replied simply. "I work maintenance." "Bullshit. Maintenance guys don't make shots like that." Frank finished cleaning the rifle and began to disassemble it for proper storage. "Some do." Colonel Stone arrived with Captain Martinez and several other officers, all looking at Frank with new interest and considerable respect. "Mr. Morrison," Colonel Stone began formally, "I think we need to have a conversation about your background." Frank looked up from the rifle components he was organizing. "What would you like to know, Colonel?" "For starters, where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Vietnam," Frank answered quietly. "Then other places that aren't in any official records." Captain Martinez studied his face more carefully, noting details that had been obscured by his deliberately unremarkable maintenance worker persona. "You were military." "For a while." Colonel Stone's expression showed growing realization. "What unit?" Frank hesitated before answering. "That information is still classified, Colonel." "Classified 15 years after you retired." "Some things stay classified longer than others." Sergeant Williams was staring at Frank with new understanding. "You're not just some old maintenance guy, are you?" Frank reassembled the rifle with practiced efficiency, his hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that comes from decades of familiarity with military weapons. "I am a maintenance guy," he said simply. "I've been doing this job for 15 years and I'm good at it. Today I also did some shooting and I'm good at that too." "But why?" Captain Martinez asked. "Why work maintenance when you obviously have skills that—" "Because," Frank interrupted gently, "sometimes the most important job isn't the most visible one." He finished reassembling the rifle and handed it back to Colonel Stone. Your weapon is ready for return to the armory, sir. Your weapon is ready for return to the armory, sir. Colonel Stone accepted the rifle but made no move to dismiss Frank. I'd like you to consider a different position. Training instructor, tactical advisor, something that makes better use of your capabilities. Frank shook his head. I appreciate the offer, Colonel, but I like my current job. But you could be training the next generation of Marines, sharing knowledge that could save lives. I do save lives, Frank replied. I keep the air conditioning working so people can sleep properly and make better decisions. I fix the plumbing so disease doesn't spread through the barracks. I maintain the vehicles that get people safely from one place to another. He gestured toward the base around them. Every job here matters, Colonel. Some are just more visible than others. The officers exchanged glances, clearly struggling to understand how someone with Frank's evident skills could prefer maintenance work to more prestigious positions. Besides, Frank added with the slightest hint of a smile, if everyone knew I could shoot, they might expect me to do it more often. As the immediate crisis subsided and normal base operations resumed, word spread quickly through Camp Pendleton about the maintenance worker who had eliminated multiple enemy snipers with precision that impressed even the most experienced Marines. Private Johnson, the recruit whose rifle Frank had identified as having a loose scope mount, approached him later that afternoon as Frank resumed his regular maintenance rounds. Sir, Johnson said, his tone respectful in a way it hadn't been that morning. I wanted to thank you for helping with my rifle earlier. Frank looked up from the broken water fountain he was repairing. It just needed adjustment, son. Sometimes the small problems cause the biggest frustrations. Johnson hesitated before asking, would you be willing to show me how you identified the problems so quickly? Frank considered this for a moment. What do you see when you look at this water fountain? Johnson examined the fountain, clearly puzzled by the question. It's broken? How do you know? Because no water comes out when you press the button. Frank nodded. That's the symptom. What's the cause? Johnson looked more carefully, noting details he had initially overlooked. The water line connection is loose? What else? For the next 10 minutes, Frank guided Johnson through a diagnostic process that revealed multiple small issues that combined to create the fountain's malfunction. His teaching method was patient and methodical, focusing on observation and systematic analysis rather than assumptions or quick fixes. The same approach works for rifles, Frank explained as he began making repairs. Most problems aren't mysterious. They're just small issues that people don't take time to identify properly. Is that how you learn to shoot so well? By paying attention to small details? Frank paused in his work. Among other things, yes. Could you teach me? Frank looked at the young Marine for a long moment. Johnson was eager and respectful, but more importantly, he was asking the right questions. What I can teach you, Frank said carefully, is how to pay attention. The rest you'll learn through practice. Over the following weeks, an unofficial mentoring relationship developed between Frank and several of the younger Marines. He never conducted formal training sessions or claimed any teaching authority, but soldiers began seeking him out for advice about marksmanship, equipment maintenance, and the kind of practical problem-solving that wasn't covered in standard training manuals. Frank's approach was always indirect and practical. He would demonstrate principles through maintenance work, showing how the same attention to detail that kept equipment functioning properly could improve shooting accuracy, tactical awareness, and decision-making under pressure. Captain Martinez often observed these informal teaching sessions with growing interest. You know, she said to Frank one afternoon as they watched him help a young Marine troubleshoot a rifle malfunction, you really should consider Colonel Stone's offer about becoming an instructor. Frank looked up from the weapon he was examining. Why? Because you're already teaching. You're just doing it unofficially. Sometimes unofficial works better, Frank replied. Less pressure, more learning. Martinez studied his face, noting the subtle signs of experience and knowledge that had been hidden in plain sight for 15 years. Frank, she said carefully, what really happened in your previous career? I mean, beyond the classified parts. Frank finished his examination of the rifle and handed it back to its owner with specific instructions for proper maintenance. "I did my job," he said simply. "Same as now." But clearly your job involved more than maintenance. Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching the young Marines practice the techniques he had been quietly teaching them. "Every job involves more than what's written in the description," he finally said. "The question is whether you're willing to do what needs to be done, regardless of whether it's officially your responsibility." Martinez nodded slowly, beginning to understand that Frank's approach to maintenance work reflected the same philosophy that had shaped his military service. "Is that why you stayed here? To keep doing what needs to be done?" Frank smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Captain," he said, "someone has to keep the air conditioning working." As months passed, Camp Pendleton's performance metrics improved across multiple categories. Equipment downtime decreased, training efficiency increased, and younger Marines demonstrated improved practical skills that weren't directly addressed in standard curricula. Most people attributed these improvements to normal operational refinements or enhanced training programs. Few recognized the connection to Frank Morrison's quiet influence on daily operations and individual development. Frank preferred it that way. He continued his maintenance rounds, arriving at 0500 each morning to begin work before most people were awake, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that made everything else possible. He fixed broken equipment, solved practical problems, and provided unofficial guidance to anyone who asked the right questions. But now, a few people on base understood that maintenance involved more than keeping machinery operational. Sometimes, it meant maintaining the standards and capabilities that kept everyone safe. Sometimes, the most important person in any operation was the one nobody noticed until the moment their skills became essential. Frank Morrison had spent 15 years being invisible, and he was good at it. But when the situation required it, he could also be visible in ways that reminded everyone what true expertise looked like. The maintenance guy who could make impossible shots when his people needed him. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story moved you, please subscribe to hear more tales of extraordinary people hiding in plain sight.